All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. James, please advance the slides. Well, first of all, I want to welcome you. I'm Wade Crowfoot, Natural Resources Secretary, as I hope many of you, that I work with know. And we are joined here today by a number of leaders of state agencies, including Jared Blumenfeld from the California Environmental Protection Agency, Karen Ross, our Secretary of Food and Agriculture, and Kate Gordon, the Governor's Climate Advisor and Head of the Office of Planning and Research. And we're really excited here today to have you join our webinar for a couple of reasons. The first is this photo on the slide is actually pretty appropriate because we are starting a journey with this webinar. And that is to engage all of you as we shape our effort to elevate nature-based solutions and implement the governor's executive order. Second point of excitement is, as you may know, today, President Biden issued a sweeping directive across the federal government to double down on climate action in our federal government, including a number of announcements that really synergize with California. And I think may even be based on some of the leadership that you all and we have exhibited in California, including announcing the establishment of a 30 by 30 goal for our nation to conserve 30% across our United States by 2030. So we may talk a little bit more about that and regarding that sort of rolling out of the announcement. Really excited. So we're going to spend some time today hearing from each of our principals, our leaders of our agencies, on just what is their role in implementing the governor's executive order. And then we're going to do a deeper dive on two aspects of the executive order. One is the call for a climate smart land strategy, and the other is the establishment of our 30 by 30 goal and a pathway, a strategy or a pathway to achieve that goal over the next decade. There will be an opportunity to ask questions, and you can do so by typing on or clicking onto the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and typing in a question. We are joined by actually almost 700 participants, and so the most efficient way that we're going to ask that you share questions is through that Q&A function. And we are focused on ensuring there's enough time to answer as many questions as possible. We'll also end the presentation outlining the ways to help us shape this effort moving forward, including a bunch of opportunities for further engagement. Next slide. So we wanted to start off with a bit of a snap poll to help you and to help us understand just who's joining us in this conversation today. So we have 3 short questions that I want to bring up on the screen, and I'm going to ask every participant that wants to help us answer these questions. So the first question is, physically, where are you joining us from today? From south to north, Greater San Diego, Inland Empire Desert, Greater LA, San Joaquin Valley, Central Coast, the Bay Area, the Sierra Nevada, including the Eastern Sierra Nevada, Sacramento or the Sacramento Valley, or the North Coast. And I'll mention that there's a couple of others. If you scroll down, you can get to also outside of California. Second question, within what sector do you work primarily? Academia and research, the business and the private sector, within community-based groups, a local government or public agency, a state government or a state agency, federal government, tribal government or tribal community, the nonprofit sector, or something else. And then lastly, what are you focused on in your work? And the options we have, however, it's never perfect. We can't be totally inclusive given that we only have 10 spaces for categories, but in any event, agriculture, climate action, climate resilience, commercial fishing, economic development such as housing development, environmental conservation and or environmental justice, forestry, working on nature-based economic opportunities and investments, outdoor recreation, both equitable outdoor access and fishing, hunting, or boating, the water sector, or something else? And then actually last question, how familiar are you with this term that we're going to talk about today, nature-based solutions? And there are different answers that you can provide there. So we're just going to take a moment to ask you to fill that out, and it's going to be, I think, interesting for all of us just to understand who's part of this discussion today. Going to give it just another 30 seconds. We've got about 85% of participants have filled out the questions. All right. We will end the polling and share with you the results of the questions, the responses to the questions. So first of all, where are you joining us from today? We're seeing the plurality of folks from Sacramento and the Sacramento Valley, probably reflecting a lot of folks from state government, a lot of people from the Bay Area, but really, actually, all of our areas are represented in the state, which is great to hear. And we have almost 10% of participants here today participating from outside of California. Second question, within what sector do you work primarily? Heavy participation from those in the nonprofit sector, over a third of our participants here today, and as we would expect, state government as well. But likewise, representation from academia, business, community-based organizations, local agencies, as well as tribes. Third question, focus of your work. So we have over a third of us today are focused on environmental conservation and or environmental justice. We also have folks that are heavily focused on climate change and climate resilience. But likewise, really representation from each category that we've identified. Again, there's no perfect way to categorize what you focus on, but we thought this would be an interesting snapshot. And worth noting that there are about 10% of us joining today that are in the water sector. And then lastly, before we move on, how familiar are you with this term nature-based solutions? And we're seeing actually a fair amount of familiarity with the term. Almost a third say that they use the term often in their work or understand it pretty well. About a quarter with some idea of its meaning, and then less people either never heard of it or very little understanding. So thanks for sharing that. We're going to then just tell you that while I think many of you on the phone are experts on these topics, one thing we want to do today is sort of level set understanding of what we're doing and the subject matter. So thanks for your patience if you're somebody who addresses these topics every day in your work. Next slide, please. Okay, as I indicated, the focus of today's discussion is to really help you all understand how we as state agencies are working to implement the governor's executive order. He issued this order in October at a sustainable orchard, Sierra Orchards, on the border of Yolo and Solano County. And here you see him talking with Craig McNamara, with Secretary Ross in the background. And we felt like this was an appropriate place to launch an executive order that's really calling for the elevation of nature-based solutions to our climate challenges and other challenges we face. And recognizing the role that we're not only talking about natural areas, but what we call our working lands, our farmlands, our orchards, our rangelands, our working forests. So this was really the beginning of the effort. And again, what we'll talk about today is what we're launching in response to the governor's direction. Next slide. So we obviously face major climate-driven challenges in the state, and these are all photos from within California. Flooding in San Jose in 2017, the results of the epic drought that we had over the last decade on fish and wildlife. The center photo is the Paradise Fire, beach erosion on the right in Southern California, and then of course the record-breaking temperatures in Greater Los Angeles this summer. And this all is emblematic of these climate-driven challenges that we face. And while we've done great work across the state on taking climate action and really being a model to the world, we obviously have to double down in our action. And that's really the clear, specific direction from the governor. Next slide. We also need to recognize this world-class biodiversity that we have in California, and that is the natural variety of plants and animals in our state. This map shows that essentially what is a heat map of the biodiversity across our continental United States. And what it demonstrates is California is remarkably rich in its natural variety. Over 5,500 species of plants and animals in our state, 40% of which are only found in our state. About 250 of those species are either threatened for being endangered or listed as endangered. And so we have in California been identified as one of 36 biodiversity hotspots in the world, with an exceptional concentration of biodiversity, but also facing unique stressors that threaten that biodiversity. And important to note as we look at these photos is we're not only talking about animals and plants, but of course the remarkable microscopic diversity that we have, including in our soils. So part of the photo, I should say the large thrust of the executive order is not only to help us take and double down on climate action, but to elevate the importance of preserving our biodiversity as the planet actually faces a crisis of mass extinction. Next slide. So really the key takeaway of this executive order is to bring a new set of tools to our climate and environmental action, and that is nature-based solutions. And we offer a very simple definition here of nature-based solutions as actions that either work with and enhance nature's ability to help us address societal challenges. And it recognizes that healthy ecosystems not only benefit those animals and plants that are there, but provide benefits on which we all rely. And these photos give different examples of nature-based solutions in our own state. Clockwise from upper left, coastal wetland restoration in Southern California and the Bay Area. Top right, the inclusion of hedgerows in our agricultural operations to improve biodiversity and support pollinators. Bottom right, this is the Yuba watershed, where the Yuba Water Agencies and its partners are actually identifying upper forested watersheds as key investments that they need to make and restore and maintain in order to protect the supply and quality of their water. And then bottom left, the Urban Green Alleys program in Los Angeles to create more shade trees in park-poor communities in Los Angeles, but also capture stormwater runoff. So examples, limited examples of a broad array of different solutions that we can bring to the fore. And I'll say that while in California, we've been remarkable at energy efficiency standards and renewable energy generation and transportation electrification, I would argue that we haven't given the enough emphasis to these nature-based solutions. And so the governor's executive order is really elevating our focus and our prioritization of these solutions. Next slide. As we advance this executive order, and we're going to talk more about 30 by 30 and climate smart lands, we have to recognize that we do this work in ways that are going to allow us to meet multiple priorities that are high on the list for policymakers and residents, certainly including the restoration of our natural world, but also maintaining our economic prosperity in the agriculture sector and beyond, continuing to build housing in our state to address cost of living challenges, and to expand recreational access for all Californians, with the focus on equitable access for those communities that have lacked access and continue to lack access to our nature and outdoors. So keep in mind, as we implement this executive order and as we talk about the projects that this encompasses, our focus remains on doing this in ways that help us meet all of these priorities of Californians. Next slide. So I'll soon turn to my colleagues to share their perspectives from their different agencies, but I'll let you know that fundamental to our work are partnerships. We in state agencies are not going to be able to do any of this alone. And so it really relies on working with you all across the state. And these three photos provide an example of some partnerships we've already launched. The first being a partnership with NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory to utilize satellite data that reflects back on Earth to help us build our understanding of our nature and how our nature can actually be utilized to address these societal challenges. The middle photo is emblematic of an effort that we're engaged in called Cutting Green Tape, which is helping environmental restoration happen more quickly and cost effectively across our state, recognizing that we're sort of in a race against time as it relates to climate change and biodiversity loss. And we have to do things like restoring streams and expanding wetlands more quickly than we have in the past. And the third photo of a woman named Elizabeth Maremba Marumba, who is the Executive Secretariat of the UN effort on biodiversity, represents the fact that our state agencies for the first time are engaged in the United Nations Conference of Parties on Biodiversity. You may know that California has been a leader as a subnational government in this international discussion on climate change. Well, earlier this winter, I should say, we announced that our state agencies are now engaged on behalf of California to support this international effort to achieve an agreement across our planet to protect biodiversity. So these are external partnerships, but obviously it starts with the internal partnerships of my colleagues as part of the discussion today. So I would next want to turn it to Jared Blumenfeld, of course, our leader of Cal EPA, to reflect on today, of course, with the federal announcement and all, I would say all that you're doing with Cal EPA. But I first see the slide of Karen Ross, who is another one of our leaders in state government who leads our Food and Agriculture Department. So Karen, really excited with your leadership and invite you to share thoughts on what this all means.
Thank you, Secretary Crowfoot, and sorry to bump you, Jared, but I'll get to you.
I always want to be, we can fist bump.
Yeah. Okay. Now, today's a good day, and I'm so excited about a renewed partnership with the federal government. A lot of the work that CDFA has done in the space of climate smart agriculture has actually been built on building blocks that were created during then Secretary Vilsack's leadership. So I know we have a good friend to support our efforts here in California and to really advance what we've been able to demonstrate with the investments that we've been able to make with the leadership of Governor Newsom and before that, Governor Brown. I'm excited about this opportunity to talk about nature-based solutions and the real opportunity it brings for even more collaboration and partnerships. Our farmers and ranchers are as diverse as the state of California is, both in its landscapes and the crops that we grow, and in the people that grow them. We are an important contributor to the economy, and the recognition of natural working lands being inclusive of our farms and ranches is very important. Our 70,000 farmers and ranchers manage and own a fourth of the state's total landmass, about 25 million acres. So we know that as we produce safe, nutritious food to make it available to local populations and to the globe, we are also being threatened by climate change and the loss of biodiversity. So it's important that we all join together in partnership to address these very real challenges. Some of the on-farm practices that have been proven out and that we are funding through our climate smart agricultural programs include things like planting cover crops. When we plant cover crops, we're improving soil health, we're cycling nutrients, we're attracting pollinators and other beneficial species, and we're controlling wind erosion. Prescribed grazing, you can see those cows in the background there. This is a planned rotational grazing practice that moves the cattle around to manage and reinvigorate our native grasses, which builds resilience for wildfire and for drought. Compost applications provide a multitude of benefits, including building soil organic matter while continuing to cycle biomass and manure back into the soil. That healthy soil is the real key here. Speaking of diversity, 2,500 different types of soils in the state of California. Healthy soils help us better infiltrate and hold water, which is a key issue for a state with a Mediterranean climate like California. And that will defend us against extreme weather events like the intense heats that we've seen and droughts. We know from the fourth climate assessment that was released in 2018 that a 1% increase in soil organic matter over the state's 25 million acres of ag land could lead to 1.5 million acre feet of water holding capacity in our soil. To put that in context, that's the equivalent of nearly filling up Lake Berryessa. We're also excited about the California Biodiversity Collaborative that you mentioned, Wade, bringing together all of the experts in this space along with our communities to pursue an approach to protect biodiversity. We know, and we've seen it in the Sacramento Valley, what farmers have done in rice country with being able to be a winter home for the Pacific Flyway. And in the wintertime, at least 230 species of wildlife that are there and receiving nourishment from those rice fields. Natural and Working Lands Climate Smart Strategy will meet long-term goals across the land sector. Soils represent the largest reservoir of organic carbon on the planet and are home to a fourth of the living species. That's from the United Nations. To date, California has invested $42.2 million in grants for 643 Healthy Soils projects to sequester carbon and improve soil health. And I know that land conservation is an important part of this strategy, and our colleague, Director Gordon, will talk about that in a moment. Specifically in the executive order, Governor Newsom directed CDFA to do a convening of farmer and rancher-led solutions to inform the next scoping plan at the Air Board. Those solutions will be based on science, and they will be led by our farmers and ranchers who understand the importance of protecting these natural resources. So later this week, we'll be announcing a series of 6 roundtables throughout the month of February to solicit ideas and inputs from farmers and ranchers, from technical assistance providers and other stakeholders, real solutions for climate change, and as the president said in his statement today, that can prove verifiable carbon sequestration. These roundtables will be organized around 3 topics: livestock, annual crops, and perennial crops. Our goal is to capture the entirety of solutions that are identified by farmers and ranchers to mitigate climate change and enhance biodiversity. Speaking of climate scoping plan, I want to introduce my colleague, Secretary Blumenfeld from Cal EPA. Take it away, Jared.
Thanks, Karen. Really appreciate it. Thanks, Wade and the whole team. And mainly thanks to the 786 people who are joining us today. Really appreciate all your energy, all your dynamism. Karen, Wade, myself, Kate, none of us would be doing this if it wasn't for your energy and passion and experience and knowledge around these issues. So really want to thank you and encourage you to keep pushing us, keep innovating and thinking about how we can do this better, quicker, and really engage every single farmer that wants to become a carbon farmer, every single forester that wants to engage in this movement. So as Karen and Wade outlined, natural and working lands are key to meeting our carbon neutrality goals, which is what, as Karen just teed up, the scoping plan is all about. So what our focus is we need to make sure that we do everything we can to reduce emissions from natural and working lands and enhance resiliency to achieve sustainable sequestration. But because natural and working lands operate on a decadal scale, we really need to act now if we're going to see results in achieving carbon neutrality by 2045. We just can't wait to 2045 to start these efforts. They need to happen immediately. So the natural and working lands climate strategy will serve as the foundational input for the scoping plan update, which CARB will launch in a few months and finalize at the beginning of next year. We want to make sure that each of you know how to engage and that you engage with us and all the natural and working land experts on understanding the critical role that forest, wetlands, rangelands, and other land types can play on our path towards carbon neutrality. Beyond climate and our carbon neutrality goals, we know that protecting and effectively managing our natural and working lands can protect and restore watersheds that supply drinking water to our communities and can help California avoid catastrophic wildfires that threaten progress on cleaning up our air. As we face the consistent threat and reality of wildfires in California, we've been consistently reminded that the stewardship of this state's first people since time immemorial is a model that we need to understand, and that traditional ecological knowledge really can help inform how we relate to our landscapes. Both Wade and Karen mentioned the important role that tribal partnerships play in meeting our natural and working lands goal. And this really can't, from my perspective, be emphasized enough. The Biden administration's actions bring back a fundamental recognition and respect for tribal sovereignty, which is key to meeting our shared climate goals and our carbon neutrality targets at a global scale. And I particularly want to really acknowledge what happened today. Karen was mentioning it and Wade as well, but just bringing back this focus on science, bringing back a focus on how we work across government is critical. It's imperative if we're going to deal with this challenge. I view this challenge as so large that every single person needs to be involved. Every single entity needs to understand what their job is. And I'm particularly excited because natural systems, I think, have the ability to both enhance our economy, move us towards more regenerative agriculture, and at the same time, get us to a place where we're achieving carbon neutrality. And with that, I think I am turning it over to Dr. Kate Gordon, who's going to talk about the next phase of our natural and working lands plan.
Thanks, Jared. I am on favor of people who have PhDs being called doctor. I am not one of those people. So thanks for elevating.
But you do have a PhD, or you don't?
I don't.
Oh, you don't?
I have
okay.
a law degree. So technically
fine.
I'm honorable, I guess, as you are.
Well, no, you're a Juris Doctor.
Exactly. But thank you for the elevation of my academic status. It's so great to be
Always.
here with all of you. Again, I'm Kate Gordon, Director of the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, and the Governor's Policy Advisor on Climate. And, I think you've heard this really articulately from Secretaries Crowfoot, Russ, and Blumenfeld, but just want to underscore how lands have been, frankly, a missing piece of our state climate strategy for a while, both in terms of emissions reductions and our strategies around climate adaptation and broader resilience. But that is changing. As we've talked about, our natural working lands are critical to California meeting our climate goals. Our landscapes can both sequester and store carbon, particularly with good land management practices on our working lands, and also provide valuable protection in lessening the impacts of climate stressors and extreme events that we're already experiencing. And I recently was in Napa County going on a distanced hike with someone, and really you can see this in operation. The vineyards that have acted as buffers between wildfires and developed areas up there are a real reminder of why our landscapes and our natural working lands are such an important part of our adaptation and resilience picture. In addition, land conservation is a key component to our larger land use and planning goals as an administration. It's the other side of the coin to the governor and our administration's commitment to infill growth and housing development. My office at OPR and the Strategic Growth Council look forward to our relevant work on land use and planning being part of this strategy, and to partnering with CNRA, especially through the Strategic Growth Council's very relevant Sustainable Ag Land Conservation Program, or SALC, and the Climate Change Research Program at SGC, as well as land use and planning at OPR. Implementation of N8220 and the Climate Smart Land Strategy is highly complementary to our infill growth and development strategies and as an administration. And we really at OPR look forward to leveraging this effort as we work on several ongoing and parallel work streams, where we are working hard on the larger question of reducing our vehicle miles traveled in the state, which is a critical part of our climate strategy, while really prioritizing infill housing or housing near jobs and services. these are not only core climate priorities for Governor Newsom and the administration, they're core equity strategies as well. It's critically important that this state provide more affordable housing, provide more access to jobs and services without the need to do a massive amount of driving across the state. And that, of course, is a climate strategy as well. Across all our efforts, we're ensuring consistency with the state's articulated and the legislature's articulated planning priorities, which are prioritizing compacted infill development, promoting equity, and conserving natural and working lands, as well as coordinating our infrastructure investments that we make from the state level across all of these things. We're very eager to plug in the ideas that emerge from the Climate Smart Land Strategy and from all of you as core stakeholders into our ongoing efforts around sustainable land use planning and development, and into another major project between OPR and the Resources Agency kicking off this year, which is an update to our state's adaptation strategy. So with that, I'll turn it back to our partner in crime on all these things, Secretary Crowfoot.
Kate, thanks so much. And I should have mentioned that we are recording this webinar and we will be putting it up on the website for those who are not able to join us today. So look for that. And again, as you have questions that you want us to address in the Q&A session, please do just click on the button on the bottom of your screen and go ahead and ask us a question. A few of you have asked if folks can actually phone in separately on a phone line, and actually that's not possible in this, and we hope those folks would be able to review the recording of this webinar. So we're now going to dive into two aspects or two parts of the executive order. The first is the thrust to improve our management of natural and working lands across the state and to develop a climate smart land strategy. And the second is to advance this 30 by 30 goal, which again, President Biden just announced for our entire country. And leading this effort are staff across our agencies, and representing that work next is Amanda Hansen, our Deputy Secretary here at the Natural Resources Agency, who's going to talk more about what the heck are natural and working lands in this context, and how are we going to better utilize them to reach all of these goals.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Secretary Crowfoot, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. Really excited to kick this off. I thought I would just start with outlining some of the many values of nature-based solutions, and I'm not going to repeat what many of the speakers have outlined in their remarks. Obviously, we get many benefits from investing in nature-based solutions, and these benefits extend well beyond climate change. And so I think there's just a couple of things I want to just add to the conversation, which is, first, I think it's important for context and to give a sense of scope. In California, natural and working lands cover 90% of our state. So this is a significant area of opportunity for us. Second, we've heard that the science is clear. We can't achieve carbon neutrality by 2045 without the natural and working land sector. And we know that landscapes play a critical role in protecting people and nature from the impacts of climate change. What I want to underscore, though, is that many of these nature-based solutions can achieve both of these goals at the same time. So, for example, our forest investments are going to reduce the risks of catastrophic wildfire, and they will also help restore our forest role as a carbon sink rather than a carbon source. So really unique characteristic of nature, many of these nature-based solutions. And finally, I think the other point I want to flag that hasn't really been raised is just that, we know that the cost of inaction in this sector is very high. The science tells us where we need to go by mid-century to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. And so we really need our lands to be helping us solve the problem and not making it worse. We all pay the price when we don't invest in nature with our health, our economic growth, and our ability to protect the most vulnerable among us. Next slide. So the governor's executive order, as Secretary Crowfoot and others have mentioned, really elevates the role of natural and working lands as a key pillar of our climate change strategy. And natural and working lands is the term we use in California to describe the nature-based solutions sector. It consists of all of the iconic landscapes we know and love: our forests, coasts, wetlands, farms, ranches, urban green space, grasslands, deserts, and more. I think Wade mentioned earlier that the executive order issued several directives to ensure that California is driving action in this sector as aggressively as we can. One of those actions is to call agents on agencies to explore and undertake opportunities to accelerate our efforts in this space. We refer to this as the Natural and Working Lands Action Agenda, and it's really focused on 5 pillars: forests, wetlands, agricultural soils, urban green spaces, and our land conservation efforts. I won't go into a lot of detail on this, but I do want to just flag that we're making a lot of progress on this directive. First, we're making new commitments. The governor's budget proposes nearly $1.3 billion in natural and working lands investments, which will directly contribute to these action agenda pillars. We're also coordinating across agencies to explore opportunities to expand the adoption of nature-based solutions. So where is it, for example, that we might be able to introduce tree shading and other green infrastructure investments to be incorporated in energy efficiency programs? We're working with Cal OES and OPR to explore how nature-based solutions can deliver on FEMA's resilience programs. And we're, of course, working with grant program administrators to build nature-based solutions into guidelines and application requirements where possible. Lastly, we're identifying gaps in our approach. And so, for example, there's a real need for coordination and strategy to accelerate action in the urban green space pillar. And I just want to ask everyone to please stay tuned, because we're going to be launching listening sessions to better understand priorities in this space amongst all of you. And this input is going to feed into not only executive order implementation, but also the state adaptation strategy and other relevant efforts. Next slide. So the executive order called on the Natural Resources Agency to coordinate the development of a natural and working lands climate smart strategy, a long-term framework for action that we need to deliver results in this sector. It's going to identify and advance land management efforts that help us protect vulnerable communities, achieve carbon neutrality, improve public health and safety, and expand economic opportunity. It's meant to take the long view and identify how we can improve our efforts in the coming years and decades to advance our climate priorities and other key goals. It's going to inform our 30 by 30 efforts, our 2022 scoping plan, and the state adaptation strategy. Next slide. There are a number of questions that state agencies are exploring as we think about how to develop this strategy. And I thought I would tick through a few of them today just to share with all of you. First, what actions can we recommend within the strategy to improve equity? Could explore climate smart land management that protects vulnerable communities, that increases access to nature, expands employment opportunities in nature-based industries. This is an important question. We're also thinking through how could we best identify and prioritize climate vulnerable communities. Through the Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resiliency Program, Director Gordon's office, OPR, is committed to developing a platform to identify climate vulnerable communities across California. It won't be complete until after the strategy is due. So how can we use our efforts in this development of this strategy to support that broader tool development? Another question we're exploring is how can we ensure that this strategy can contribute most usefully, meaningfully, and credibly to the 2022 scoping plan. And as Secretary Blumenfeld mentioned, CARB is getting ready to kick this off. And the way that we're talking about this with our colleagues and partners at CARB is the climate smart land strategy is going to set out the what, and the scoping plan will set out how much. Finally, and I think a very important question, how can we deliver a statewide strategy that reflects and reinforces regional priorities? Really important to ensure that we understand approaches to sequester carbon and avoid emissions are not necessarily location specific, but the opposite is true for building climate resilience, equity, and economic opportunity. Next slide. What does success look like? We think that a successful strategy will accelerate and expand climate smart land management across California, increasing carbon removal and sequestration, better protecting communities and ecosystems from climate-driven threats. And we wanted to leverage funding and other resources to move the needle in this sector. including through tracking and measuring our progress and demonstrating what is possible in this sector for other parts of the world where these nature-based solutions can make such a difference. Lastly, I just want to flag that our efforts to expand climate smart land management really overlap with our 30 by 30 initiative. So success also means building a climate smart land strategy that will help us meet 30 by 30 by, for example, expanding conservation practices on working lands. Likewise, 30 by 30 can help our climate smart lands effort by prioritizing conservation of landscapes that have large or high carbon sequestration potential, or the ability to really protect vulnerable people and places. So for this reason, these two efforts cannot exist in silos. They have to work together. And so to ensure this integration and alignment, we are planning to use one stakeholder engagement process and the same geospatial information and system to develop our climate smart strategy and our 30 by 30 pathways. I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague, Jen Norris, Deputy Secretary for Biodiversity and Habitat, for more on these intersections and the 30 by 30 goal. Thanks again.
Jen, you're muted. You need to unmute yourself.
Thanks, James. I have mute on. Somebody had to do it. It was going to be me. Thanks, Amanda. I'm Jennifer Norris. I am the Deputy Secretary for Biodiversity and Habitat. I am running point on the 30 by 30 effort, but I also want to acknowledge Mark Gold. He's our Deputy Secretary for Coasts and Oceans, and he's my thought partner for all things salty. So he'll be here for the Q&A at the end. Before I dive into 30 by 30, I want to take a few minutes to talk about the California Biodiversity Collaborative, which will serve as the hub for advancing our 30 by 30 effort this year. The executive order called for the Biodiversity Collaborative as the next generation of the state's biodiversity initiative. It really puts working together across sectors and regions at the center of our conservation work. The Biodiversity Collaborative is intended to bring together organizations and leaders from across our state to share information and build on best practices, coordinate public and private programs and investments, develop new partnerships, and to take shared action. The Biodiversity Collaborative isn't a single body, rather it's a network that we at the state will tap for ideas, insights, and counsel to inform our statewide biodiversity goals. Next slide. The Biodiversity Collaborative has four main goals: to, one, understand our biodiversity and the threats it faces, protect California's species and native ecosystems, restore and repair ecosystems and habitats, and engage and empower all of California to sustain our natural places and common home. To learn more about what we're doing and who we are, please check out our website. We encourage everyone who's interested in biodiversity to join this inclusive conversation. Next slide. So the collaborative is going to work on many things, but this year our focus will really be setting us on the path to conserve 30% of our lands and coastal waters by 2030. As you've heard, 30 by 30 is part of an international movement to protect biodiversity and combat climate change. So far, over 50 countries have signed on to the pledge, and it's very exciting that the United States has joined this group. As the Secretary mentioned earlier, this executive order directs us to achieve 30 by 30 in a manner that protects biodiversity, combats climate change and promotes climate resilience, improves recreation and equitable access for all, and maintains our food security and economic prosperity. We're required to report on strategies to achieve 30 by 30 by February 2022. So over the next year, through the collaborative and inclusive public engagement process, we will be developing those strategies and present them in a document we're calling Pathways to 30 by 30. The Pathways to 30 by 30 document will do a number of things. It will provide a baseline assessment of the amount and location of lands and coastal waters currently conserved in California, establish a process to track and account for progress toward the goal. It will identify conservation opportunities to help California and partners achieve 30 by 30. It'll help us figure out where are the best locations to meet our biodiversity, recreation, and climate goals. It will identify funding and policy tools to support conservation in California across different land ownerships and land uses, and it will connect the dots between existing efforts and related plans. Next slide. The big question that seems to be on everyone's mind is, what is conservation? This is one of the key questions we'll be exploring as foundational to this Pathways document. So what is conservation? Beyond wilderness areas and wildlife preserves, what should we count? We know conservation doesn't mean just locking up land with a fence around it. Recreational lands, working lands, all can contribute. Also, other questions we'll explore is, as we work to conserve 30 by 30, how do we balance access, biodiversity, and climate resilience? What are the most promising approaches and opportunities across ecosystems, ownerships, and management types that will help us achieve our goals? And are there particular challenges or considerations for different regions, ecosystems, or partners? Next slide. To help us explore these questions, we are developing a geospatial information system we're calling California Nature. This system will bring together existing data on biodiversity, climate change, and recreational access into one integrated place. We're going to get data out of silos and into one system. We'll also include maps and data that identify existing protected areas. Using these integrated layers and our definition of conservation, we'll determine how much of California is already conserved and how far we have to go to achieve our goal. We'll also be able to see gaps and opportunities for conservation, where on the landscape we can best meet our objectives. For example, this system will allow us to see where our biodiversity hotspots intersect with our needs for equitable access and carbon storage, or which areas are projected to experience extreme heat or flooding, and where we'll have needs for green infrastructure. This system will be publicly available for anyone to see and to use as they help us achieve 30 by 30. This integrated map and analysis tool will help us develop information for both the Pathways document and our climate smart land strategy, and allow us to track our progress toward 30%. Obviously, this is a lot to do in a year, but we don't intend to do it alone. We are very pleased to announce that Esri, a world-class and California-based geospatial software company, is providing the state with technical support to help us build this California Nature system. But we're going to need your help as well. We'll need your active engagement to help us build Cal Nature, develop the Pathways document, and work with us in partnership to achieve 30 by 30. Today is the beginning of an important public engagement process to inform and shape this effort. I'm now going to turn to Andrea Ambres, our Deputy Secretary for External Affairs, who's going to walk us through our public outreach efforts for this and other processes and how you can get involved.
Thank you. In order to shepherd these efforts, we are absolutely committed to building a strong and inclusive collaboration process to ensure that all interested stakeholders, including you today, and leaders in groups and others can participate in the implementation of this work. This includes, as outlined in the executive order, collecting ideas and feedback from California Native American tribes, academia, research institutions, conservation groups, the private sector, and of course, local, state, and federal government partners, among others. We look forward to engaging tribal governments through government-to-government consultations, as well as specific tribal listening sessions that we'll host to incorporate traditional ecological knowledge. We'd also like to hear from other sectors throughout the process. We'll seek your ideas, your perspectives, and your feedback. So beginning this winter and spring, we will be hosting conversations both regionally and topically to receive your input to help inform our work. We recognize that different areas and Californians across the state have unique perspectives and that are important that we want to include, and our outreach aims to be as inclusive and incorporate as many diverse views as possible. Regional discussions will explore opportunities and considerations in local areas to meet our 30 by 30 goals and our climate smart land management. They'll be scheduled in the forthcoming weeks, and we anticipate hosting meetings with participants from regions across the state, such as the Central Valley, Bay Area, Los Angeles, Inland Desert, among other areas. This will be an opportunity to gather and share ideas from local stakeholders within the same environment and community. We look forward to engaging with various groups, including offices of elected officials and local organizations, to solicit that feedback and also to incorporate opportunities to extend invitations to local partners also. The topical discussions will explore key questions such as how to advance equity within these strategies, or how working lands can support our climate and biodiversity goals as an example. We look forward to working with a diverse set of groups, including the Resources Legacy Fund, lending their philanthropic support as an example to ensure that our engagement is thorough, thoughtful, and inclusive. We will also, as Secretary Crowfoot mentioned a bit earlier, stay informed with efforts on the federal level to advance 30 by 30. Proudly, California can serve as an example of this leading work. Next slide. So we invite you to stay updated with us. Please visit our webpage to stay updated and engage on this work. We listed the link below. We aim to share information in a transparent manner, and we'll share updates throughout our agency website and this particular page. In the coming weeks, we will post upcoming meetings and workshops on this website, and we'll share relevant updates to the work. We'd like to learn from you on some of the pressing issues of interest or any questions you have, and we'll be sending a follow-up survey for you to share any additional of those questions. For those on today's webinar, we will add you to our email list for project updates. For those that aren't on today's webinar, if you know of others who wanted to join, they can send an email to us at outreach@resources.ca.gov with NBS, and we'll make sure to add them to the email list. We'll share the recontact information again, and before we go, we'd like to engage you in one last poll. So I'm going to turn it over to Secretary Crowfoot.
Hey, thanks so much, Andrea and the team. This has really been a remarkable effort to get this far, but obviously, moving beyond this is going to require engagement with everybody as part of this discussion. So we're going to have an opportunity for question and answer, and we've got a lot of very good, meaty, sophisticated questions coming in. I number, over 50. So we're going to spend the last half an hour answering as many questions as we can. And then, as Andrea said, there is a follow-up survey that you're going to get both at the end of this webinar and by email. And that's going to have an opportunity to identify other key questions that we need to answer or suggestions that you have on either the process or the content of what we're doing. So that'll be an opportunity if your question doesn't get answered. But let's go to the final couple Zoom questions we have. And Andrea, if you don't mind helping me pull up those questions, or Mark, that'd be great. Excellent. First question, what topics are you most interested in following or further discussing based on what we talked about today? So Secretary Ross talked about an agriculture solutions roundtable that they are convening to make sure that we have agricultural leadership and engagement in all this effort. The climate smart land strategy that Amanda outlined, the 30 by 30 effort that Jen outlined, also the California Biodiversity Collaborative, or just the overall effort. Obviously not an exclusive list nor a mutually exclusive list. So we're interested in understanding sort of where the thrust of interest is within the participation on this webinar. And then secondly, how do you want to engage in the effort moving forward? Email updates, regional discussions, participate in these workshops by subject, for example, maybe on equity or on the definition of conservation. Providing email feedback to us, actually submitting written comments, or just still figuring it out. So if you can, take a moment to answer these questions. The way this technology works is I can see that more and more people are answering the questions. And then in about 10 seconds, I'll close off the poll, and then we can together look at the results. All right, we have about 3/4 of those joining us responding. So I'm going to close it off right now just so you can see the results. And what's interesting is that it looks like there's pretty broad interest across the board in these different pieces of the executive order. Certainly 30 by 30 is, 2/3 of folks actually want to be engaged and learn, sort of follow that. But then obviously a lot of interest in each of these other aspects of the executive order implementation. And then second question, how do you want to engage in the effort? Well, almost everybody wants to receive email updates, and we'll do that. We won't abuse your emails with too much email, but we will provide you updates. importantly, when we're holding conversations on these different topics and in different parts. But almost 2/3 want to engage in the regional discussion, and then a majority, 3/4 want to participate potentially in subject by subject topics, and then email feedback as well. The good news is that each of those methods of input and communication are going to be available as a result of the effort of our team. So really excited there. And sorry, I'm just sharing results so that you can see them. So again, a lot of broad interest in these different aspects of the implementation of the executive order, and then pretty broad interest in engaging in all of these different ways. Next slide. So now we're going to shift to the Q&A, and I'm going to sort of play MC here and do my best to make sure we can answer as many questions as possible. And then team, if we can try to capture the Q&A so that we can collect all of the questions that have been asked. And then again, you'll have a follow-up survey that you can complete less than 10 minutes, less than even 5 minutes to complete right at the end of the webinar, and you'll also get an email. First question from Pedro: to what degree will EJ, or environmental justice, be incorporated at all levels in the implementation of the executive order? And I know, Amanda, for example, you've done a lot of thinking on this. So can you just talk about, how we want to make sure that that is at the center of the discussion?
Yeah, I think there's been a significant amount of work done in California to think about ways that we can ensure our mitigation efforts, our greenhouse gas emission reduction efforts, really take into strong consideration environmental justice considerations. I think in terms of building climate resilience and thinking about ways that we can support climate vulnerable communities and those that are going to be experiencing the impacts of climate change at a disproportionate rate, this is an area of keen focus and interest in both our climate smart land strategy and in 30 by 30. So really excited to work across all sectors and regions to think about what that means and how we can use these documents to really accelerate our action in this space.
Thanks so much. And if participants have specific suggestions around making sure that equity is at the center of these discussions, please share those with us. Next question is on federal agencies and 30 by 30. Maybe Jen, you're best to answer this. Ryan asks, what role do we see for federal agencies in reaching 30 by 30? I think the data that we have suggests just over half of the state's land mass is actually controlled by those federal agencies.
That's a great question. And just yesterday, I started that conversation with some of our federal partners. I think we absolutely want to be working across all land management types: federal, state, local, regional, and private lands. Conservation can occur in all those sectors. So I think we'll be driving on all of those as part of our overall goal. But there is a tremendous amount of opportunity on federal land for partnership, especially now that they've committed to that goal.
Yeah, and I would say huge announcement today that the president actually called for 30 by 30, and we think California is really well positioned to sort of, with first mover status, to roll up sleeves and actually work with these federal agencies. So excited about that. Good question from Gladwin that I might ask Kate Gordon to help us answer. So Land Use Authority in California is really heavily focused on local government and local planning. And there's been considerable conflict on land use between the state and the federal governments. So how are we going to work with local land use authorities as we advance these natural working land solutions and 30 by 30?
It is a great question. And of course, in California, there is a lot of deference to local governments and regional governments on land use. I will say that the state already has a framework for engaging at a regional level on the intersection between land use and our climate goals, which is the Sustainable Communities strategies, which of course are part of the Air Resources Board scoping plan. That's a place where regional government works very closely with local government and across the general plans in each region to identify greenhouse gas emission opportunities, frankly, for reduction. We really at OPR see that as an important part of the strategy for also engaging on these questions about carbon sinks and about resilience. How can we think about urban greening strategies? How can we think about balancing acts between land conservation and development? So I'd really say that the SCS and the way that it interacts with the general plans is very important. The other point, Wade, and it's one that I think is increasingly just being seen as urgent across California communities, is this real desire to see local governments lean in, and we at the state are really supporting that, lean in on infill housing. So the governor has put significant resources last year and this year in the budget proposal to the Infill Infrastructure Grant Program, which is essentially the state's helping cities to build the underlying infrastructure for infill housing. We are leaning in on the California Environmental Quality Act exemptions that all apply to sustainably built infill housing already. OPR is trying to make that easier to navigate and understand, and really, to your cutting the green tape point, really trying to clarify and align those incentives. And we also at OPR have developed a very cool tool that I recommend people look at called Site Check, which actually allows you to look by address at all the CEQA exemptions that are available, again, for sustainably built infill housing. So I think that the combination of those things, kind of taking a regional approach on planning and also really aligning our housing subsidy and strategy around infill, it's such a critical part of the natural working land strategy, but it's also just a critical equity point. People cannot afford to live an hour and a half away from their jobs. That is not affordable housing, given the transportation costs. And so we're leaning in kind of across both of those areas, and really excited at OPR and the Strategic Growth Council to keep being a resource to local governments on that.
Thanks so much, Kate. And that's a great example of one. We could do a deep dive workshop, for example, on local state partnerships on these efforts, or the role of local planning. So we could further unpack that together with Kate's leadership. Jared, question for you. The famous Fran Pavley is joining us today, and Fran, of course, is one of the leaders that sort of started the whole climate action and AB 32. So thanks, Fran, for joining. She says, hey, good job, a lot of benefits in the 30 by 30 plan. How are these programs going to sort of link into the scoping plan, and how will emission reductions on natural and working lands get measured?
Hey, Fran, and everyone else that's focused on this. Yeah, super big kudos to Fran, and thanks for continuing the work down in LA. So the key, Fran, is going to be, as you know, Richard and Rajinder and team, joined by Leanne Randolph, who actually harks back to resources, and many of you know is now the new CARB board chair taking over from Mary. The goal in scoping plan is to really define the measurable result from each action. So the scoping plan's goal is to show how we can, between now and 2045, economy-wide, reduce as much as we can in every different sector. So mitigate the emissions. We'll be left with, there's no way we think we can get to zero. And there's going to be different sectors where we're still at positive emissions. So the frame of carbon neutrality, as you know, Fran, and others, is to show how we can offset those by sequestering carbon. So there's two ways of doing that. And Wade's shop is working on one of them with ours, which is carbon storage utilization, CCUS, carbon capture, utilization, and storage. The other is a natural frame, which is the natural and working lands portfolio. But before we can put a number in the scoping plan, we need to show that X project will demonstrably relate to X reduction in carbon or sequestration. And so that's the project that we really need the most help from all of you, the scientific community, others listening, that really have those metrics. And I know everyone from Marin Carbon Project, Lawrence Livermore, to the project that Wade teed up with JPL, there's a lot of science on this. So the more you could give us information that really sets some clear parameters around these types of activities on the landscape, in wetlands, in forests, on agricultural lands, on rangelands, will result in X amount of reduction. That's what we need, Fran, in order to move the scoping plan and get it done. Because if the range is too big or too uncertain, we're not going to put it in the scoping plan. I know that will frustrate a lot of people. but we need that certainty to be able to actually count the emissions.
Jared, thanks so much. There are a bunch of questions about how we're going to define conservation on the 30 by 30 goal. Somebody references one database that suggests that over 30% is already protected. Others are saying, referencing other sort of databases or approaches. And then a person asks, is this 30% more or 30% total? So I can say this, we're focused on 30% total conserved. And as Jen noted, one of the key questions to unpack in this engagement process is, how are we defining conservation? What lands fit the definition of conserved, to really understand the baseline from which we're starting and what we need to actually get done to reach 30 by 30. So more on that to come. And if you have an opinion on that or thoughts, then we'll definitely want you to engage in these 30 by 30 discussions. Jennifer has a question more specifically on ensuring tribal leadership and tribal engagement. So how is that going to work? I can answer that one and explain that probably in the coming handful of days, we are issuing a solicitation for government-to-government consultation with all California tribes on the topic of the implementation of the executive order and all of sort of these subparts. And we are very open to, we will be holding broad sort of group consultation process meetings, but also interested in specific bilateral government-to-government discussions. So we hope that this identifies just the critical centrality of tribes in all that we're doing. And we believe this can be a method to advance the governor's goal to strengthen tribal sovereignty, to restore where possible tribal management of natural resources and ancestral lands, and co-management of natural resources as well. So we're looking forward to that. Sumit has a question around how can high-tech innovators, AKA Silicon Valley tech nerds, contribute to this effort? Can we help accelerate, scale, organize in any way? So maybe I'd turn to you, Jen, because you talked about Cal Nature, which I think Esri is going to be helping us with. How can folks that want to bring their tech chops to this effort contribute to either the development of that or more broadly our work?
That's a great question that we're still really in the process of sorting out. We're just getting started on identifying the appropriate data layers and the information that we want to pull from within government. And we will move into the next phase, which is tapping all those great resources that we have around the state. I want to give a shout out to Mark Gold, who of course has been really spearheading our relationship with NASA JPL, which is looking into new opportunities to leverage, satellite data down to the soil that we can bring into this effort. Maybe I could turn to you, Mark, for an answer. Help me out. One nerd to another.
Yeah, no, I would just add to what you're saying with JPL. We've had this mutual. We entered into this MOU. It's been really productive to get our staff from many different agencies, working with them to talk about all the various different available data that they have, and to try to share it with us in real time as much as possible so it can actually influence our policy making and decision making much closer to real time. There's been this big gap before on when science is completed and when data is available, on when it gets used by government agencies, and we're really trying to narrow that gap in a major way. And we are just thrilled by how enthusiastic Cal EPA, CDFA, and CNRA has been to work with JPL, and how excited JPL and NASA are to really focus on biodiversity and other critical environmental monitoring issues in the state of California, and use it as an example for the rest of the country.
Mark, thanks. Hey, while you're on the screen, there's a question coming in about ocean protection. And as you've educated me, state waters run from the tide line to 3 miles out. And right now, 16% of our coastal waters in state authority are under the marine protected area. So one question is, does this automatically mean that 30% are going to be conserved? And how does that impact sort of the scientific review you're doing on the efficacy of the marine protected area network?
Yeah, thanks. the 16%, of which 9% total of California's coast is a no take, is our baseline. We are definitely looking at those areas as being conserved. They were put together with just unprecedented stakeholder involvement, as well as including the scientific community to come up with that. Same time, we've got this decadal review of the MPA network, the Marine Protected Area Network that's occurring right now. That'll be completed by the end of 2022. So we're not talking about adding to the MPA network definitely between now and the end of 2022. We need to see what the science shows us on that decadal review. That being said, the stakeholder engagement process that you heard from Andrea and so many others is going to be really critical to talk about what is conservation in California's coastal waters. And when you look at the fact that we have areas of special biological significance, a total of 34 of them, we have 3 national estuary programs, we have national marine sanctuaries, which are very, very large, that all afford some level of protection and conservation. That's going to be part of the discussion with the stakeholders to really try to figure out what more needs to be done to get all the way up to 30% conservation of our coastal waters.
Thanks, Mark. Over to Secretary Ross, a few questions around, tell us a little bit more about how we're going to find out about these agriculture roundtables, recognizing how important it is for farmers and ranchers and folks from agriculture to be important in this. How can people stay connected to the convenings that you're doing there?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you. This is Jenny Lester Moffett. I'm Undersecretary at the Department of Food and Ag, and Secretary sends her regards. She had another commitment at noon. Great question. We will be sending out a press release later this week that will have information on how you can engage in those farmer and rancher led solution roundtables. So stay posted, and we'll make sure that that the listserv that we've gathered here will also have that information as well, so we can make sure we share it through several different channels.
Excellent. Some questions coming in from state employees, scientists and professional conservationists within Fish and Wildlife and our state conservancies, sort of raising their hand and saying, hey, don't forget about us as we go out and do that engagement. We have a lot of professional and scientific expertise within the agency. So Jen, just a reminder that we really want to tap all of the expertise across our agencies so that all of our employees actually feel part of this initiative.
100%. And we've started that conversation at sort of the deputy secretary level, and we're trying to move through all the different groups to make sure that we're working across agency within the departments. Absolutely, we want everybody involved. So great news.
Right. Yep. There's some really good questions that I just want to flag, and if anybody wants to take a crack at them, they're kind of longer. Kala asks a question about this notion of, conserving and, how are we going to really understand the functional capacities of these lands that are being conserved? She says, conserve, yes, and are they healthy? Do they need management or restoration? Which areas are doing well and which areas are in need of extra attention? So I don't know, Jen or Jenny, anything you'd add to start that conversation?
I can start it, and Jen, I think you're probably more apt to talk about it. But yeah, I mean, this is something that we've been talking about in at least in ag land for quite a while, is that as we protect our land, that it also needs to have the management practices along with it. We talked earlier about the SALT program, and that's a great example where we're really adding in that layer of management practices in the program as well. But I'll pass it to Jen, who can really go into more of the landscapes.
Well, I would agree. I think there's sort of different scales of question. Where on the landscape do we have the best opportunity to do all the different things we want to do with regard to climate, biodiversity, and access? But then there's sort of and then there's, how do you protect that land in perpetuity or, into the future? And how do you make sure that it stays, healthy through time? And that requires management and monitoring, and maybe ongoing, active work on that landscape. So all of those questions need to be sort of brought into this conversation and are among the things I think we'll be exploring in these topical workshops.
Yeah, and I will say we don't believe that we and state agencies in Sacramento have the answer to these questions. And really this, if we're really effective, this is going to be a pretty democratic initiative in the sense, lowercase d, of course, inclusive, where yes, state agencies are playing their role, but so are, tribal governments and federal agencies and local governments and nonprofit land conservancies and trusts and academia, et cetera. So these are issues that we're going to, I think, need to unpack together. Christina has a really good question that I just want to highlight, which is one serious barrier to increasing conservation or protected lands is the lack of ongoing funding for land stewardship and operations and maintenance. As we add areas that we're protecting or conserving, this problem becomes more acute, particularly for some of our departments like state parks or, and some of those public agencies or private land trusts may become reluctant to take on more. How might this be addressed? And I would say, that's the $1 million question. One thing that, we want to be clear-eyed about is we're setting this goal, but really going to be working with the federal government on, creatively figuring out how we get this done. We are in a challenging economic situation given the pandemic, et cetera. So this is, this executive order is not a blank check to make these investments. So Christina, I just want to flag your question as one that we need to elevate moving forward to make sure that we're not just figuring out ways to, check the box on conserved status without helping ensure that those lands remain healthy and productive. Good question. Sarah asked, how can the private sector actually support and engage with this process? Anybody want to take that on? Andrea?
Yes, I'd be happy to. We, through both the regional discussions as well as the topical conversations, we absolutely would love to invite private sector partners from business or trade or associations to participate. Additionally, if there are any opportunities for us to learn from you or to gather any feedback on particular data, much like my colleague Jen Norris mentioned earlier, we'd absolutely love to hear about some of those opportunities to learn from you and to engage. Please feel free to reach us through our email and let us know if you'd like to have further discussions. Everyone and anyone is absolutely welcome to provide us some input.
And Wade, I'll just jump in on one additional point on this, which is such a great question. One of the things we've really recognized, I think, globally on climate, but particularly in this administration, is that government can't do this alone, that this is a partnership with the private sector. We cannot meet our climate goals. We cannot meet our critical initiatives without engagement from the private sector. And you heard Secretary Ross talk a lot about that on the agriculture side. You'll see in the governor's budget proposal a real recognition of this, that we have created and are looking to capitalize a climate catalyst fund within the state government that would actually provide low interest, no interest loans and loan guarantees to projects in the private sector that are facing risks on the kind of conventional lending market, but that are real solutions to some of these issues. And this goes to the tech question earlier too. There's all kinds of exciting work being done in water reclamation, in land management practices, in nature-based carbon removal. All kinds of stuff is happening out there that is not quite ready for prime time with traditional financiers and lenders. But we as a government really have an opportunity to de-risk those projects and really, prop them up and help them out and really spur that innovation. So we're excited about that opportunity. And I think it's a place that the governor's really leaning in.
Great. Thanks, Kate. Good questions about sort of how we work with local governments on this. Guillermo from TPL says, we should be asking local governments how they can contribute to 30 by 30 and identifying opportunities. Liz, the leader of TNC, really talks about that there's work already happening at the local and regional level, and how do we plug into that? And then good question that I'm looking at, suggesting, hey, how do we find out if our local local leaders actually even understand that this is underway? And I think all of that speaks to the importance of these regional discussions. So we hope to come to your part of California, ideally physically, but perhaps virtually. And we were briefing legislative staff on this rollout and this webinar yesterday, and we made sure to commit to inviting state legislators and their staff as well. So I think these regional discussions will be a really good opportunity on that. And then I think to the extent that there are good models that are working, for example, the green print in the Bay Area has been referenced by a few folks on the in the chat. Be great for you and your follow-up survey, folks, to let us know where you think we should be looking more toward models of this, or models that can inform all of this work. So let me just keep on going. Campbell Ingram, who leads our Delta Conservancy, asks, are there ways that we can simultaneously focus on the needed planning and early implementation of 3030 and climate smart land strategy pilot projects? So really good point there. I mean, what we don't want this to be is a planning exercise for the next 2 years. We want to actually get projects on the ground working. And we think that there are projects already underway to meet 30 by 30 and climate smart lands. But I do think we're really interested and excited to begin to make progress. I think from our perspective, the effort to achieve 30 by 30 and better management of lands for climate really started when the governor issued the executive order. So to Campbell and others with promising pilot projects or proof of concept projects, I think we're excited about how we move those forward. Really good question from Sarah around integrating community college and state university students when it comes to opportunities, maintenance opportunities, internships, volunteer opportunities. She's a CSU Chico student, and she wants to join our just established Climate Action Corps in 2022. So Sarah, just huge kudos to you for your leadership, in college, but then excited that you're going to join this work hopefully on a full-time basis. Just a note to everybody in this discussion, today President Biden announced a national National Climate Corps initiative. We're really excited about that, and we hope that California's effort that Governor Newsom and our Chief Service Officer Josh Friday announced last year was the seed to that. So we have really incredible young people serving in this first cadre of Climate Corps team, and we have efforts to allow for just regular citizens, or regular residents, I should say, that have an hour of their time to actually plug in to Climate Corps. So please Google California Climate Corps to find out more about this. And then just a note to Jen, Andrea, Jenny, the whole team, let's figure out how we integrate students and graduating students into this effort. Great questions from a couple of you, including Kim, about the durability of conservation. As we saw during the Trump administration, some of these conserved areas, for example, by federal agencies, were moving out of conservation status. So really good question about the durability of those lands. How do we assure that what we count as conservation actually stays conserved beyond 2030? That's a tough question. So Jen, let me put you on the spot to give a pithy answer.
Conservation over the long term is it's something you have to return to again and again. Unfortunately, it doesn't always stay in place. But I think, and with climate change, it's totally possible that where we want to conserve 10 years from now might not be what we're focused on right now. So I think it's really important to be thinking about conservation, both as a long-term strategy, but also sometimes a near-term strategy to get us to that point. And again, those are some of the topics that I think we're really going to be digging into as we get into these topical conversations, is how do we achieve this? What are the tools in our toolbox? Some of them are things like fee title. Some of them are conservation easements. Some of them might just be short-term support for people to keep different, biodiverse crops on their land that support pollinators in the near term. And all those things, whether they're part of our 30% or they're part of our overall strategy, that's something that we need to sort of sort through and get to. And that's some of the information we'll be providing in the Pathways document. That's our goal.
Excellent. We're coming to the conclusion of our webinar, but a couple important questions. One of which is, how can we utilize this to support economically struggling rural communities? And I'm happy to take a crack at that, or allow any of my colleagues to do that. We're serious when we say that this is not simply an environmental effort that exists in a silo to conserve biodiversity or to take climate action. This really has to address both environmental but also economic and social goals. So we need to embed economic prosperity and opportunity in this, as well as equity. And so, as Jen mentioned, part of these plans, and Amanda mentioned, is really what are actions that we can take within this initiative that will expand opportunities for rural communities, that will actually help us better deliver equitable access. So I don't think we have any clear, pithy answers right now, but those are questions that we're going to be asking throughout the process. So if you are somebody who leads or lives in a rural community, we very much want your engagement. Another question is, on the sort of, in contrast, how do urban green areas play into this, both in their kind of ability to meet our environmental goals and achieving, equitable access? Jen or Amanda, do you want to try to take that on?
Yeah, I'll jump in and just say, I think this is an area of incredible opportunity. There's so much that can be done in urban areas to accelerate nature-based solutions that will support sort of a broad variety of state goals. And those can be climate, those can be biodiversity, but they can also be public health. They can also be economic opportunity. So from my perspective, this is an area of extreme interest. I think the other, real intersection here is extreme heat, and thinking about what we can do to mitigate the impacts of extreme heat through our investments in urban green spaces. So really looking forward to diving into this issue in particular through these listening sessions and through all of the engagement that has been laid out today. It's a very important and exciting area to explore.
Thanks, Amanda. And we should start to wrap it up here. So I'd ask James to bring back up the slide, the second to last slide that identifies where more information will be shared on the website, as well as where you can email us. I'll also note that you should be getting a post-event survey, both linked after this webinar and emailed to you. Please take a moment. If you think we fell short in this presentation or ways to improve the outreach, let us know. Likewise, what informational resources you think we should have. I'm blown away by the number of questions that have been asked, almost 200 in our chat here today. And as we noted, we had several thousand people, approaching 1,000. So clearly there's a lot of interest and leadership on these topics across the state. And we really invite you and ask you to participate in all of the engagement that we're going to initiate. So really later this winter and spring will be the time when we're rolling up sleeves together and doing these regional discussions and these topical workshops, et cetera. So many thanks to you all. Huge thanks to the team. And as always, to James and Mark and those folks that helped the technology happen. Heather, greatly appreciate it. Have a great week, and we look forward to working with you this year. Take care.